Authorities, Regulation 19, Publication, Draft Local Plan Consultations. Again, another mouthful. We never do anything short and sweet on the planning, it would appear. So, Basildon Borough Council has been consulted on the regulation, publication, draft local plans for Braintree, Colchester and tendering councils. These are 3 local authorities located in the north-eastern part of Essex, and if you refer to your slide pack, you've got an extract from their plan there just to give you a bit of a sense of where they are in case you're not familiar. So these 3 authorities have worked together to put together what they call a Part 1 local plan, which is a shared strategy for growth in North Essex. They have looked at their settlement hierarchy to determine how growth should be distributed to their existing settlements. So the larger settlements of Braintree and Colchester have been allocated the largest quantum of housing, that's where most of the services are provided. Smaller settlements such as Whitton and Clacton have also taken some growth, but not to the same scale as the larger settlements. However, that isn't sufficient to meet the growth needs in their area. Their housing requirement is around 43,720 over a 20-year period, and extending those settlements alone is not sufficient to do that. They also recognised in that area that there would be longer term requirements for housing. So what they've done is worked together to identify 3 locations where new garden communities could be established within their area. And the extracted map identifies those locations to the west of Braintree, between Braintree and Colchester, and then to the east of Colchester, kind of adjacent to where Essex University is. These 3 settlements, because of the lead-in times and the amount of infrastructure required, will only deliver around 7,500 homes during the plan period, but actually in the longer term they will deliver between 29,000 and 43,000 homes. So it's a long-term strategy that they're pursuing. In terms of that meeting their objectively assessed need, their objectively assessed need for housing was assessed by Peter Brett Associates, who carry out that work all over the country. It was based on the 2014 CLG household projections that I referred to earlier in my response to Council of Fellows, and it seems to be in accordance with planning practice guidance. So the strategy that they've got appears to be responding to the housing need in that area. In addition to that, they intend to deliver between 65 hectares and 137 hectares of land for employment purposes, and the range there reflects the uncertainties around the strength of the economy and the mix of growth in different sectors that might occur over that period or might not occur over that period. They are forecasting that they will deliver around 1,900 jobs per annum, and that work's all based on models that are industry recognised and doesn't give any particular concerns technically, particularly given that there's not very strong economic relationships between North Essex and South Essex where we're located, particularly in relation to commuting patterns for labour and support. So overall the plan is looking robust. However, and it's not giving rise to any unmet needs that we would need to consider. However, the North Essex authorities do sit beyond the extent of the metropolitan greenbelt, and physically North Essex is much larger than South Essex and a lot less developed currently than this area. So it might be the case that if we had unmet need in South South Essex, we may be needing to ask North Essex to consider meeting an element of our unmet need in the future. However, we don't know what the scale of any unmet need in South Essex is at this time. We cannot quantify it because the joint working between South Essex authorities isn't sufficiently advanced for us to be able to do that. And it would probably be unfair of us to expect them to wait. They do have housing needs and housing targets and residents that need those homes and businesses that need that broken out. So given that they're out of consultation, it is recommended that we maybe highlight to them and to the inspector dealing with their examinations in public that we haven't had, there are no clear review mechanisms within Part 1 of their local plans that we maybe suggest that one be included, so that any considerations arising from unmet needs in South Essex could be considered at a later date. Each of the three authorities in North Essex also have a separate Part 2 to their local plans, and the Part 2 sets out the individual policies for those authority areas. It deals with the non-strategic matters. Now, given that North Essex is relatively remote from us, it's not considered that there are many cross-boundary impacts with Basildon. However, consideration has been given to the matter of gypsy and traveller accommodation, as this is assessed and considered at an Essex-wide scale. It should be noted that Essex-wide work on the need for gypsy and traveller provision is emerging at this point in time. Its publication has been delayed by the capacity of consultants undertaking that work, because I think they're doing it for probably 90% of the authorities in the country. It's a very specialist area and very few people do that work. So they are the same consultants that are undertaking Basildon work. Consequently, the Basildon work is also emerging, rather than being finished for the same reasons. But there's no particular compatibility issues between their evidence base and our evidence base on the basis that it's using the same methodology. Page 137 of your report sets out how each of those three authorities are dealing with gypsy and traveller issues within their Part 2 local plans. Braintree has a need for between 6 and 10 pitches to meet the need of travelling travellers who fulfil the definition within the planning policy for traveller sites. They also require a further 20 pitches for those travellers who do not meet the definition but have a requirement for culturally appropriate accommodation. They are intending to meet those needs through allocations within their strategic development sites, so on the edge of Braintree and around Witham, and also in the garden village within their area. Colchester, their emerging evidence indicates there's need for 3 pitches for travelling travellers and 10 pitches for those who require culturally appropriate accommodation but do not travel. This kind of doesn't quite align with what's in their Part 2 publication draft local plan. There's a discrepancy where they say they only need 2 pitches for travelling travellers. I suspect that that's just an issue around the timing of the evidence base and the policy being prepared. But certainly something that needs to be highlighted to them. They're intending to meet their need by identifying specific sites. Tendering has an emerging need for 2 pitches for travelling travellers and 5 pitches for those who require culturally appropriate accommodation but do not travel. Their policy in relation to this matter is somewhat confusing and isn't entirely clear as to what their approach is to meeting that need, and probably that needs highlighting to them. When this is compared to Basildon's requirement, there is a somewhat different scale of issue. So if I could refer you to the last slide in your slide plan, it probably makes the 3 or 4 paragraphs I've written about this a little bit clearer. The work that's emerging for Basildon that hasn't been finalised at this time identifies a requirement for 36 pitches for travelling travellers who meet the definition. There is also an unknown group of gypsies and travellers who weren't able to partake in the interview process, and it has to be assumed based on legal advice that they meet the definition in the PPTS. That's the planning policy for traveller sites. This gives rise to between 4 and 38 additional pitches for those gypsies and travellers that meet the definition. There is also a need for 51 pitches for those who require culturally appropriate accommodation but do not meet the requirements of the PPTS. We still have a duty to consider their needs under section 225 of the Housing Act 2004 as amended. This gives us a requirement going forward for between 91 and 125 pitches for the accommodation of gypsies and travellers, whether they be travelling or requiring culturally appropriate accommodation. In 2015, we undertook work on potential supply, and that was called the Basildon Gypsy Traveller and Travelling Show People Site Studies, Site Provision Study 2015. And that identified a maximum capacity for accommodating such needs within Basildon Borough of 72 pitches. It should be noted that that work occurred before the PPTS 2015 was published, and many of the sites promoted and found to be suitable were single or small sites within the borough's upland areas. And it's not actually known at this time if these sites were intended by those promoters for travelling travellers or travellers who require culturally appropriate accommodation. So work is commissioned to commence shortly on an update to that position so that we know where that supply lies in terms of its intended use. It has to be said, however, the work that was undertaken in 2015 was fairly exhaustive in terms of the search for sites, and it's not expected that there'll be a significant uplift in the number of pitches available. So the figure will still be around 72. It's just that we might be able to split it between those that have a cultural requirement and those that are travelling under the definition. Given that that is the case, there is a potential unmet need for pitches within Basildon Borough of up to 53 pitches, which is quite a large number, particularly when you consider it against the overall requirement in some of the other authorities as discussed earlier. It's therefore recommended that a request is made of those three North Essex authorities to consider whether they have capacity to meet any of Basildon's unmet need for traveller pitch provision prior to their making a submission of their respective plans to the Secretary of State for examination in public. I would just draw your attention to the fact that when Braintree consulted on their draft local plan in 2016, they were asked to consider this matter in a formal response then. And prior to this, Braintree and Colchester were both asked to consider this matter in relation to draft local plan publications early in 2014. So this wouldn't be the first time those two authorities have heard of this, and there has been no engagement from either authority to date on this matter. So that actually gives rise to a concern under the duty to cooperate, similar to the concern that refers to the Castle Point local plan, and where the inspector found that Castle Point had been deficient in their duty under the duty to cooperate because they hadn't actually given serious contemplation to the requests that had been made to them. So, to conclude, the recommendation to the committee as set out starting on page 133 of your agenda pack, is that we should issue a consultation response on behalf of Basildon Council, and separately they should be sent to Braintree, Colchester and Tendring councils on or before the consultation closing date of the 28th of July, raising the following matters. So in respect of part 1 of all 3 local plans, support for the strategic approach to growth set out in part 1 of their local plans, but a concern that an unmet need for housing may arise in South Essex, which may need to be considered by the North Essex authorities in the future, and a review mechanism should be included within part 1 of each local plan to enable this consideration to occur. Additionally, in relation to the Braintree part 2 plan, a formal request that unmet need for traveller pitches arising from Basildon be considered prior to the submission of the local plan for examination in public, and a concern be expressed that previous requests for such unmet need to be considered has not been responded to, giving rise to procedural concerns associated with the duty to cooperate. The same is repeated for Colchester, and in addition to that, a concern is raised that the policy doesn't align with the evidence base. And if you recall, there's a pitch difference in what's set out. And then for tendering, a formal request is made to them with regards to the unmet need. However, as we've not previously been consulted on their plans and not previously responded to their plans, we can't raise the duty to cooperate issue that's been raised with regards to Braintree and Colchester. We would, however, express a concern about the fact that their policy with regards to duties and travellers is not entirely clear and does not provide confidence that they will actually be meeting their need. In terms of alternative options, you could decide not to respond to these consultations. However, this would affect our ability to influence the North Essex authorities' local plans to ensure that they don't have an adverse effect on us now or in the future. And it would also call into question whether, as a council, we're meeting our duty to cooperate under Section 33A of the Planning and Compulsory Purchase Act, as we wouldn't be able to demonstrate how we're dealing with the duty of traveller issue that currently exists in an effective cooperative way. In addition, if we don't respond, we can't actually participate in their examination in public. These issues persist until the submission version. Thank you.
Thank you, Madam Chair. With the unmet need for traveller pitches, I think the legislation changed a year ago where if a traveller was not travelling for a certain period of time, they were then classed as not a traveller anymore. Is that what that definition is there? Definition would require culturally appropriate accommodation.
So legislation changed, but what happened, and Lorraine might want to come in on this as well, what happened was the Housing Act was amended to take the definition of what a traveller is or isn't out of legislation. The definition is now in planning policy. So in terms of the travelling travellers, so those travellers who continue to lead a nomadic lifestyle, they are covered by planning policy for traveller sites, and we have a requirement as part of the local plan process to consider their needs. For those that no longer lead a nomadic lifestyle, they can still, however, be considered to be culturally part of the travelling community, even though they are settled. And they are treated as a group of the population no differently to anyone else living anywhere else, except that under the Equalities Act, the councils need to bear in mind that they have a cultural connection to living in Canada.
So So if they occupy a plot, we can't ask them, include them in our local housing to move them off that plot to free that plot up, but kind of keep them in an area close to where they reside at the moment. I'm just trying to think about, do they have a right to stay on that plot indefinitely?
Okay. So, I mean, this might be going into, it might not be easy to answer this, because obviously all of those gypsies or travellers that, I'm assuming it's those that, your question is directed to those who don't travel anymore.
Yeah.
So those gypsies or travellers that don't travel anymore all have, or most have, a planning consent which says what they can and cannot do. The change of definition isn't retrospective, so it doesn't cancel out any of those planning consents just because their status in the Planning Act has changed. However, if they were to submit a planning application to do something different on the land or expand, etc., that change of definition would now be taken into account.
Councillor Morris? I think one would want this, but it becomes a little puzzling here. We're talking about these travellers who are settled. So why do we need to find pitches for them if they're settled? I'm a little confused here.
Okay, so the complexity of this is that we don't have to meet their needs to comply with the planning policy for traveller sites. So that is strictly for those travellers who continue to travel. National planning policy is split, as you know, into the National Planning Policy Framework and Planning Policy for Traveller Sites. So those that continue to travel are dealt with just by Planning Policy for Travel Sites. However, the Housing and Planning Act 2016 amended the Housing Act of 2004, Amanda's probably got the wording here, but it essentially made it a requirement for local authorities to consider the needs of caravan dwellers and those who reside in houseboats. We don't have any people, I don't think, living in houseboats, but we do have people that live in caravans. It doesn't define them as gypsies or travellers, because there are other people that live in caravans or park homes that are part of the housing mix. Basildon Borough has 2 park home sites, both of which have been greened up. It is caught, it is hooked, you're hooked in to consider their needs by other legislation in the Housing Act.
Right. Well, I thank him for that. The question I was going to ask is with regards to the other boroughs' plans. How long have we been notified that we need to make a response to them? Because it seems to me that we're leaving a little bit tight when this is going to be responded to by the 28th.
The consultation periods were 6 weeks, which is consistent with the Town and Country Planning, local planning regulations. So it's a perfectly legal consultation period. So I believe that we were probably consulted about 3 or 4 weeks ago on that basis that this is the first committee that this could have come to.
I was just to say that previously, under the old system, the Cabinet member would have had the ability to make these decisions under delegated powers. Under the committee system, they have to be approved by committee. So, as Amanda said, this is the first opportunity for this particular matter to be considered by you as the relevant committee with remit.
Councillor Bagot?
Thank you. Page 136, the penultimate paragraph, you did refer to it in your briefing, but it says that consideration is only being given to the matter of gypsy and traveller accommodation in part 2. What other matters are there, though, that may have been considered that we discounted?
So it would have within their design policies, their flood risk policies, they're up in the countryside, so their countryside protection policies, they don't have greenbelt, so they don't have greenbelt policies to consider. What you have to do when you're looking at neighbouring local plans and making comments is look at what the strategic issues could be across the boundaries. So that's why those other matters were discounted given their remoteness. If we were looking, say, at Brentwood's local plan, or if we were maybe looking at Thurrock's, one of our neighbours, we would have gone into a lot more detail on those other policies because they'd have been a lot more relevant to us.
One of the members, who made the decision to discount them? Because of course it's easy to say, oh, we discounted them because, but as we've seen with things like the Thames Gateway and everything else, people commute. We've been talking about economic growth and development earlier. People, for instance, ship goods from one place to another. They employ people. There could be all sorts of things which we're unaware of, which actually could be extremely relevant for us to be commenting on.
So if I can refer you to the paragraphs at the top of page 136, it's the first whole paragraph that deals with the economic issues there. So we looked at the strategic issues, the housing, the economic. The Part 2 plans deal with those more detailed matters, and it was a matter of professional judgment as to what those cross-boundary issues would be, given the remoteness of those authorities to Basildon.
Thank you, and I always support officers in their professional judgment.
Are there any more questions from members? I'd like to invite comment from Councillor Blake.
Yes, quickly. Do our transit sites incorporated in this at all? I am gathering everyone knows what they are, because it's obviously very relevant, certainly to Basildon.
Could we have a quick definition of what a transit site is, please?
I mean, I can, but I'm more than capable, but I'll leave that to officers, but yeah. He knows I can.
So Councillor Blake might actually be able to give the explicit definition as it is, so mine's going to be paraphrased, but do chip in if you need to. So transit sites are a type of site that can be lived on for a temporary period of time by gypsies or travellers who generally those who continue to travel. So they travel around, don't have anywhere to park up, or if they do park up unlawfully, and therefore there is a concept that transit sites are part of the solution, in one school of thought, to how you would manage that. Transit sites, certainly in the 1990s and before, were more commonplace, but over time most local authorities have either developed those into permanent sites, or they've been lost to gypsy and traveller for other uses already. So that's my paraphrase definition.
Yeah, just to add on a couple of things, I think they were looking at about 2 sites over the county, and what happens is each borough, wherever the sites eventually go, each borough will contribute to the actual building of that and the maintenance of it, so it's not a particular borough that get it. The only problem with that is if you have them in your borough, and there's an influx of travellers, just say for argument's sake in Chelmsford, if they serve a section 61 on them, they can move them off. They can actually move them into your borough, and then what could happen is you could then next day have an influx of travellers come into your borough, and then you wouldn't be able to house them at all. So I'm personally not in favour, but it is something that's being considered. That's why I thought it was relevant to this, as to whether those boroughs those other areas are being asked to contribute, or where we are actually with that over generalising. And I think that's that right. You happy with that? Yeah. All right. So that is it. Yeah. Good.
So in response to Councillor Blake's question, the potential need for transit sites in Essex was last discussed when the Essex-wide Gypsy and Traveller Needs Assessment was done in 2013. This is the piece of work that all of the authorities are currently, those 90% of authorities that the consultants are looking at to update at the moment. And the Essex-wide one and the Basildon one are two examples. That concluded, and that was independent advice, that wasn't necessarily advice of the local planning authorities, that a way to assist in addressing unauthorised encampments was using the school of thought that transit sites, one in the north of Essex, one in the south, but no indication as to where, that was just the principle really, based on main commuting paths and main travelling paths in Essex, might be a solution to those incursions that had occurred previously. There are mixed views as to whether, politically and professionally, probably say there, as to whether or not transit sites are a good way forward, and there are pros and cons that committees would need to understand going forward. The emerging study at the moment is silent on the matter. That is an area where we have asked, well, what's changed? What's the change in that school of thought? Why has you can't just take it out of the report and not you guys would query, I'm sure. So we are querying why that is currently left out. But at the moment, there is no legal requirement for transit sites to be provided. There is no shared position, I think, at an Essex level as to whether transit sites should be pursued. And they don't feature in the Braintree Colchester or tendering local plans.
Right, and move to the vote on this one. So this is one recommendation, I'm told, so it's voting for everything for the one. So those in favour of the recommendation? Thank you very much. Okay, right. Moving to the last item, that's the draft group work programme.